I think that the media has, so far reported on masculinity as an extremely unidimensional issue. So masculinity is seen as either negative or again as positive. So if you look at the way in which, rape and crime is reported on, masculinity is seen as something which is negative, and there has been a term in the media which has been used as toxic masculinity. So that is something which has, that is a term that has emerged quite a bit in the last couple of decades. And on the other hand, we always had this positive or heroic projection of masculinity. To answer your question would be to go beyond those two kind of, unidimensional ways of looking at, positive masculinity in terms of the heroic ways in which, men are often projected, which creates, paradoxically a pressure on men. Men are seen as the breadwinners, or if men are not successful, then that's considered something which is, not really something which is acceptable to society. On the other hand, men are also projected as criminals or as negative, toxic aspects where gender crime is also concerned. So these are two opposing views, whereas I think the way in which character sketch or the anti-heroic character sketch would develop masculinity would be to look at masculinity from a much more subjective manner. And that's why the anti-hero has a vulnerability to his or her character. And today even women have a masculine aspect to them. So gender is no longer a binary. And as Carl Jung said, both men and women have the yin and the yang force, both. So when you look at it from that point of view, you can see that even women need to sort of, work on that masculine aspect to subjectivize it rather than to look at it as a unidimensional toxic thing, or as a positive heroic thing which has all the pressure on it to, only be successful or be seen as heroic or positive. So, I mean, feminism also, I mean, there are a lot of different, perspectives to feminism. Feminism in history has undergone a lot of changes. It has evolved through different periods and movements. And today the third wave of feminism is seen as that wave of feminism which is a female gaze that not just looks at only itself but also looks outside. So, with so much of objectification or too much of focus on women, when women look outside them and they are given that power to, to also have the gaze that traditionally was only a male gaze. When you look at the female gaze, then I think that is a third wave of feminism which empowers women to not only always be the subjects or the objects of any narrative or any media narrative, but also to have the control of the gaze in their own eyes, which also then transforms the way in which masculinity takes shape. So women therefore then have a power to look at masculinity, patriarchy, as well as other society related aspects of character or history from their female perspective, and that empowers women to take control over several historical and narrative forces. So that is a third wave of feminism. And while there are pseudo waves of feminism, there are different perspectives to feminism which have emerged through history. And I think even feminism is a process. So the way in which feminist thought emerged in the 19th century may be very different from the 20th century, but it was a very important part of that process without which we wouldn't have the feminist perspective that we have today. So I think in terms of, yes, pseudo-feminism, I think it's also about different perspectives informing the women's movement, which leads to a more progressive feminist movement eventually. Masculinity, when you subjectively look at it, then you can understand how masculinity evolves not just through the traditional notions of what is a man, but masculinity is not only about manhood. It is also about the word masculine, as I have said, it emerges through the word muscular. So muscles is something which is the physical aspect of every human body as well as every animal body, and that is where the physical aspect of change lies. So when we talk about masculinity, we are actually talking about a subjective aspect, and in order to look at the way in which men have been projected throughout history, I think it's important to therefore study masculine character.
matrilinear systems
Right.
in Meghalaya or elsewhere,
Yeah.
even in the Buddhist societies, Buddhist cultures. So what is your take on that, and have you addressed that in the book?
Yeah, so I have not looked at specific states, but yes, there are matriarchal as well as patriarchal societies. So again, this is, part of this binary, where if you look at the way in which women have sometimes, been deified as goddesses, or even sometimes the power equation does lie within women. So these are aspects which are all part of this, binary, where there is a constant power, game between the masculine and the feminine forces, and this affects the way in which, of course, men and women are both projected through literature and cinema, and also it influences and impacts everyday lives as well. So I think that when you look at this aspect from the point of view of this binary, and you look at subjectively looking at masculinity as something which is part of both men and women, then I think in the long run this divide will sort of be melted, or it will sort of merge in a way in which a new kind of a character or a new kind of an understanding of identity will emerge, where gender will of course remain. We cannot do away with pure masculinity or pure femininity, and there is nothing positive either about completely eradicating femininity or masculinity. So if you look at the way in which Jung has dealt with this topic of gender in the psyche, he looks at the yin and the yang in the psyche. So these are both aspects which need to be in balance with each other. So even when you look at it from a social point of view, if you look at the collective conscience of any country, whether it includes Meghalaya or any other aspect or any other part of India, then I think that collective conscience also needs to have a balance between these forces for there to be a general, more balanced growth where identity is concerned. So even in terms of whether you look at it from the larger forces of the community or the individual, I think both come into balance when you really look at, this subjective aspect of gender and masculinity and femininity being a part of both men as well as women. And when you look at it from the pure sense also, it can be seen as a subjective force, because it's not necessary that even pure femininity is necessarily anti-men, or that pure masculinity is anti-women. So when there is even a pure masculinity or a pure femininity, I think if it is fully developed and there is an awareness of the other, then I think that it is absolutely possible for these forces to be in balance. So where masculinity is concerned, I think the Western media's approach on masculinity is far more negative, or it could also be also far more unidimensional. So while there have been heroic characters in the West, I think that the West also in today's contemporary period tends to demonize masculinity a lot more than it is demonized in the East. Perhaps because the East is still developing, so masculinity is still not, reached that power point that it has in the West. So because of that, there is more sympathy for masculinity in India still, or in the East as well. Whereas in the West, I think it has already reached that stage of, of heroism with the end of colonization and with the end of the colonial regime and their economy. So because of that, I think the way in which they now see masculinity is a lot more unidimensional than the way it is seen in the East. So I think that's a great question, because the East and the West do have a different perspective, and actually the East and the West are also two binaries in that sense, in the way in which they view character or masculinity. And the West has therefore looked at masculinity as well as character from a very unidimensional point of view, because if you look at the way in which they report on the East, most of it is not ground reporting. A lot of it is done from the West itself. So a lot of it is done from their desk and their cubicle, whereas the local reporters are all based in India or in the East here. So I think that really does affect the way in which they view it, because they are seeing it from a very bookish manner in that sense. So it is seen from a more academic, more bookish, and a more I think, more bureaucratic or a more paper-centric manner. So rather than it being on the field, where there are local reporters actually interviewing people on the field. So that subjectivity is definitely today more in the East, and that binary in itself is, what influences masculinity.